On any given morning in 1983, a man could be seen making his way through the streets of Greenwich Village in lower Manhattan, dressed in a bathrobe and pajamas and slippers, his hair uncombed, his face unshaven, moving slowly along the sidewalk and muttering words that made no sense to anyone within earshot. Residents had grown used to the sight. Shopkeepers glanced up from their windows and looked away. Pedestrians stepped around him. He was, to the neighborhood, a familiar and harmless presence, an elderly man who had clearly, over many years, lost his hold on reality, a sad case, a man who needed looking after. He was also, at that exact moment, the boss of the most powerful organized crime family in the United States. His name was Vincent Gigante. He was known to the people who were allowed to say his name as Chin. To the people who worked for him, his name could not be said at all. If you needed to refer to him, you touched your chin with your finger, or you formed the letter C with your hand, and you moved on without explanation. His network of criminal enterprises reached from the fish docks of lower Manhattan to the concrete foundations of the city's most famous skyscrapers, from the waterfront operations in New Jersey to the labor halls of half a dozen unions. He ran approximately 300 made men. He had been running them in one capacity or another since the early 1970s. Law enforcement did not know this. Law enforcement knew something different entirely. Law enforcement knew that the boss of the Genovese crime family was a heavy-set man named Anthony Salerno, known as Fat Tony, who sat outside his social club in East Harlem with a cigar in his hand and a fedora on his head and conducted business with the relaxed authority of a man who had nothing to hide. Fortune magazine had confirmed it. The FBI had confirmed it. The indictment, when it came, named Salerno as the lead defendant, the top of the pyramid, the most powerful gangster in America. They had the right organization, they had the right crimes, they had the wrong man at the top. This is the story of how the most powerful criminal family in American history hid its real leadership for more than 2 decades, of the man who played the role of boss, while another man gave the orders, and of the performance so extraordinary, so sustained, so perfectly maintained across 30 years of public life that it took the full machinery of the federal government, dozens of cooperating witnesses, and the subject's own eventual admission in open court to finally bring it to an end. 2 men, 2 very different performances, 1 stage, and the audience, which included the FBI, the United States Attorney's Office, and Fortune magazine, never suspected that the real show was not the one they were watching. East Harlem, 1985. Anthony Salerno is at the Palma Boys Social Club, 416 East 115th Street, a corner storefront at the bottom of a 4-story tenement building in a neighborhood he has worked and lived in for the entirety of his adult life. He is 73 years old. He is heavy, as he has always been, hence the name. He has a cigar, he has a fedora, he has around him the specific atmosphere of a man at the center of things. The FBI has known about him for years. They have watched him. They have photographed him. They planted a listening device inside the Palma Boys Social Club in June of 1983, and for more than a year, the bug recorded everything. Conversations about construction contracts, about union negotiations, about the internal business of the New York families, about men who needed to be dealt with, and debts that needed to be collected. The recordings were thorough. They were incriminating. They were, the government believed, the evidence of a boss in full operation. Giuliani had spent the better part of 3 years preparing this case. He had 350 FBI agents. He had 171 court-approved wiretaps. He had bugs in cars, in social clubs, in a house on Staten Island. He had, he believed, the boss of the Genovese family sitting at the top of his indictment, exactly where the boss belonged. On the day of the indictment, Salerno was arrested. And on that same day, February 25th, 1985, a man named Vincent Gigante was admitted to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, claiming to have experienced chest pains and a brief fainting spell that morning. Anthony Salerno was born on August 15th, 1911, at 115 East 116th Street in East Harlem, Manhattan, the son of Alfio Salerno and Maria Carroccio, immigrants from San Fratello in the Messina province of Sicily. He came up in a neighborhood that had been, since the early years of the century, one of the most significant entry points into organized crime in the country. The Sicilian and Italian immigrant communities that packed East Harlem in the 1910s and 20s provided the Luciano crime family, which would later become the Genovese family, with a continuous supply of young men willing to work in the organization's expanding operations. Salerno was one of them. In his youth, he became involved in gambling, numbers, loan sharking, and protection rackets for the Luciano family. He was assigned to the 116th Street crew, headed by a man named Michael Coppola, known as Trigger Mike, a capo of considerable standing in the organization and a figure of real violence in the neighborhood. In 1948, Trigger Mike Coppola fled to Florida to escape murder charges. Salerno took over the crew. He was 36 years old. He did not move. He did not change neighborhoods. He stayed in East Harlem, at the Palma Boys Social Club, at the same table, in the same posture, year after year. He rose through the family hierarchy steadily. In 1959, he was documented as a secret financial backer of the heavyweight boxing title fight at Yankee Stadium between Floyd Patterson and Ingemar Johansson. No charges were filed. In 1972, he became consigliere, the third-ranking position in the family. In 1975, he was elevated to underboss. On April the 20th, 1978, he was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison for illegal gambling and tax evasion, the most serious legal consequence he had faced to that point. He served it and returned. In early 1981, after his release from that sentence, Salerno suffered a mild stroke. He retreated to his 100-acre estate and horse farm in Rhinebeck, New York, to recover. By the time he returned to operational status, the structure at the top of the Genovese family had shifted. Frank Thierry, who had been the front boss, died on March 31st. 1981, the position opened. Salerno was given the title. He understood what he was taking on. He had been in this organization for 50 years. The someone else, by 1981, was a man in a bathrobe. Vincent Gigante was born on March 29th, 1928, to Salvatore Gigante, a watchmaker, and Yolanda Gigante, a seamstress, both Italian immigrants who had settled on Thompson Street in Greenwich Village. He was one of 6 children. 3 of his 4 brothers, Mario, Pasquale, and Ralph, would follow him into organized crime. His youngest brother, Louis, made a different choice, entering the Catholic priesthood and becoming a parish priest in Greenwich Village, a few blocks from where they had all grown up. Louis Gigante would later play a significant role in his brother's story, though not the role a priest might be expected to play. Vincent Gigante's mother called him Kinzenzo. The neighborhood, and eventually the whole of New York organized crime, shortened that to Chin. Between 1944 and 1947, Gigante boxed professionally. He fought 25 matches as a light heavyweight. He was not a great fighter. His record was decent. What the sport gave him was not a career but a network. Boxing in that era and in that city was deeply connected to organized crime, and the gyms and promoters and figures who surrounded Gigante as a young boxer introduced him to the men who would define the rest of his life. Most significantly, it connected him to Vito Genovese, who was at that point a capo regime in the Luciano family and one of the most feared men in New York. Genovese paid for surgery for Gigante's mother. This was a gesture with specific meaning in this world. It was not charity. It was recruitment, expressed in the only language that created genuine loyalty. Gigante became Genovese's man from that moment. Between the ages of 17 and 25, Gigante was arrested 7 times on charges ranging from receiving stolen goods to possession of an unlicensed handgun to illegal gambling and bookmaking. Most charges were dismissed or resolved by fines, except for a 60-day jail sentence for a gambling conviction. During this period, when anyone asked about his occupation, Gigante listed himself as a tailor. On May 2, 1957, Gigante performed the act that made his name in the underworld. though it was, by any objective measure, a failure. Vito Genovese had decided to move against Frank Costello, the boss of what was then the Genovese family, a man known in organized crime circles as the Prime Minister of the underworld. Genovese wanted Costello removed. Gigante was given the assignment. Costello was returning to his apartment building on the Upper West Side after an evening out. Gigante met him in the lobby. He pulled a gun. There are documented accounts suggesting he announced himself before firing. The shot grazed Costello's head. It was a superficial wound. Costello survived. At the subsequent legal proceedings, Costello declined to identify his attacker. He could not, he said, recognize the man who had shot him. Without a positive identification, Gigante was acquitted. The story goes that as he left the courtroom after his acquittal, Gigante was heard to say to Costello, "Thanks, Frank. The failed assassination succeeded in its actual purpose." Costello, understanding that the attempt on his life had organizational sanction, retired. Genovese took control of the family. Gigante, who had pulled the trigger on the most famous hit in the organization's recent history, rose accordingly. 2 years later, in 1959, Gigante and Genovese were both convicted of heroin trafficking. Gigante was sentenced to 7 years. He was paroled after 5. He returned to Greenwich Village and was promoted from soldier to captain, running the Greenwich Village crew from the Triangle Civic Improvement Association on Sullivan Street. He was immersed in labor racketeering, loan sharking, and extortion across downtown Manhattan. By the end of the 1960s, he was a figure of real power within the organization, and in 1969, he received a gift, entirely inadvertent, that would become the foundation of the most elaborate criminal defense strategy in American history. He was indicted in New Jersey for conspiracy to bribe the 5-member police force of the township of Old Tappan. His attorneys presented psychiatric reports to the court. The reports described Gigante's mind as infantile and primitive. They described him as psychotic and schizophrenic. They suggested he might be a candidate for electroshock treatment. The judge, concluding that Gigante was unable to assist in his own defense, dismissed the charges. The bathrobe was not yet a system. It was a first experiment, a card played in a single legal situation. The card worked. What had been an improvisation went into the filing cabinet as a strategy. And over the next decade, as Gigante's power grew and the legal risks multiplied, what had worked once would be refined and expanded into something no prosecutor had ever had to face before. To understand why Anthony Salerno accepted the title of boss without the actual authority of boss, and why the FBI spent years investigating the wrong man at the top of the Genovese family, it is necessary to go back further than Gigante, to a man whose name almost no one outside the organization ever knew. Philip Lombardo was born on October 6, 1908, in New York. He was known as Benny Squint and as Cockeyed Phil, both nicknames derived from the thick eyeglasses he wore throughout his adult life. He came up through the same world as Salerno, in East Harlem, on the same 116th Street crew. The only time he was imprisoned in his entire life was in the 1940s, for a brief stretch on narcotics trafficking charges. After that single conviction, he was never imprisoned again. He rose through the family structure quietly, without the visibility that attached itself to other powerful men in the organization. He preferred it that way. He rarely appeared in photographs. He maintained an extremely low profile. He lived in Englewood, New Jersey, and spent his later winters in Florida. He was, to law enforcement, largely a background figure. What he actually was, from 1969 onward, was the boss of the Genovese crime family. When Vito Genovese died in prison in 1969, the organization needed a new leader. Lombardo was named. The distinction, and it is the central distinction that explains everything that followed, is that Lombardo chose not to exercise his authority in any visible way. He had watched what happened to bosses who were visible. They got arrested, they got prosecuted, they got convicted. He had a different idea. He installed a front boss. The front boss would hold the title, attend the commission meetings, conduct the visible business of leadership, absorb the FBI's attention, and when the legal machinery finally caught up, take the conviction. The real boss would remain invisible, insulated by the front boss's visibility, free to give orders through intermediaries, while never appearing at the top of any organizational chart that law enforcement might construct. The first front boss was Thomas Eboli, known as Tommy Ryan. Eboli was murdered in 1972. The commission approved the killing because Eboli had failed to repay a loan from the Gambino family. After Eboli came Frank Thierry, known as Funzi, who held the position until his death on March 31st, 1981. According to the testimony of Genovese family member Vincent Caffaro, Lombardo had been the real boss from 1969 onward, using Eboli and Thierry as the visible targets while he operated from complete obscurity. By the time Thierry died, Lombardo was in poor health and ready to step aside. He had already identified his successor. He made his wishes clear. Vincent Gigante would become the real boss of the family. Anthony Salerno, who had been climbing through the organization for 50 years and had arrived at the underboss position, would become the new front boss. The machinery of deception that Lombardo had built over 12 years was transferred intact. Philip Lombardo died in Hollywood, Florida, in April of 1987 at 78 years old. He had been the real leader of the most powerful criminal family in the country for approximately 12 years. He had been imprisoned once in his life. He spent his final winters in the Florida sunshine. He died without consequence. The system he built continued to run without him. It was already running without him. By 1981, the arrangement was in place. Salerno was the face. Gigante was the voice. The 300 men of the Genovese family understood the distinction from the first day of their membership. This was not a secret held at the top and hidden from everyone below. It was, in its way, institutional knowledge. When Alphonse Darco was inducted as a made man in the Lucchese crime family, in 1982 he was told, as part of the standard information conveyed to a new member about the landscape of New York organized crime, Gigante, not Salerno, was the boss of the Genovese family. This was not inside information. It was what you learned when you joined. Darco would later testify to this under oath. Gigante's name could not be spoken in connection with his actual role. His underlings referred to him by touching their chin or forming a C with their hand. The prohibition was absolute and was enforced. He issued his orders through his underboss, Venero Mangano, known as Benny Eggs, who served in that position for years and kept his silence with the discipline that characterized the entire family. Gigante's daily life was carefully constructed around the maintenance of the performance. He lived in his mother's apartment on Thompson Street in Greenwich Village. By day, he was the familiar neighborhood eccentric. Bathrobe, pajamas, slippers, slow walk, incoherent muttering. He talked to parking meters. He appeared to pray before church statues when law enforcement officials walked by. He urinated in the street. He wandered into card rooms and played pinochle with apparent obliviousness to his surroundings. By night, he was something else. He slipped out of the apartment in normal clothing. He conducted business. He met with associates. He maintained, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a second household, a second family, a mistress with whom he had 3 children. Both his wife and his mistress were named Olympia. This second life, conducted with complete discretion, was one of many demonstrations that the man who appeared unable to navigate a sidewalk was in fact functioning at a high level of operational complexity. There was a specific logic embedded in the performance, a logic that went beyond the simple desire to avoid prosecution. The federal court ruling in United States versus Gigante in 1996 documented a fact that made the entire arrangement more remarkable. In the Genovese family, a member who actually developed mental illness was a liability to be eliminated. The Captain Willie Moretti had been murdered years earlier because his genuine mental illness caused him to speak indiscriminately about family business. The code of the organization required silence and control. A man who could not maintain either was a danger. Gigante was performing a condition that, if real, would have gotten him killed. He understood this. His underlings understood this. The performance therefore communicated 2 things simultaneously. To the outside world, a man too unwell to be a criminal. To the organization's members, a man disciplined enough to maintain an absolute performance under conditions of maximum pressure, which is exactly the quality required of a boss. Between 1969 and 1995, Gigante was committed to psychiatric hospitals on at least 28 separate occasions. Fellow family members referred to these visits, according to testimony, as tune-ups. He would arrive at the hospital presenting with the usual symptoms: incoherence, apparent hallucinations, inability to communicate. He would stay for a period of days or weeks. He would be discharged with his records reinforced. And he would return to the streets of Greenwich Village, and the bathrobe, and the muttering, and the business of running the most powerful criminal family in the country. What Gigante controlled, through Salerno and through the full machinery of the organization beneath him, was not simply crime in the abstract sense, it was the physical infrastructure of New York City. The Genovese family had held control of the Fulton Fish Market in Lower Manhattan since the 1920s. The market was the largest seafood wholesale operation in the United States. Every fish dealer who operated there paid tribute, in one form or another, to the Genovese organization. Extortion fees were framed as parking charges, as security costs, as union assessments. If a dealer refused to pay, the unloading crews, also controlled by the organization, would let the fish spoil. The leverage was absolute and had been absolute for 60 years. The construction industry was a different kind of empire. 4 of the 5 New York families had pooled their controlled unions, their suppliers, their contractors, and their subcontractors into a cartel that the government would later name the Concrete Club. The arrangement was specific. Any construction contract worth over $2 million in New York City had to go through the cartel. The winning company paid a 2% kickback on the total contract value. Companies that tried to bid outside the system found themselves unable to secure the union labor they needed, unable to receive concrete deliveries on schedule, unable to build. The concrete company that supplied material for some of New York's most prominent construction projects in this period was S&A Concrete, co-owned by Salerno and Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family. A federal indictment filed in March of 1986 would specifically name a $7.8 million contract that S&A Concrete obtained at Trump Plaza, the co-op apartment building on Manhattan's East Side. The indictment made clear that the bid rigging had occurred without the knowledge of the developers involved. What it also made clear was the reach of the arrangement. Nothing of significant scale was built in Manhattan during this period without the organization's hand somewhere in the process. At the Jacob Javits Convention Center, the Genovese family's presence was so complete that a federal prosecutor later described it as a hiring hall for mobsters and former convicts. Documents from the period indicated that 35% of carpenters who worked at the Javits Center had criminal convictions. The center had broken ground in the early 1980s and was, during its construction, among the most valuable pieces of real estate in the city's portfolio. It was also, during that same period, one of the family's most lucrative operations. The Genovese family also held influence at the Feast of San Gennaro in Little Italy, operating gambling games, extracting payments from vendors, and diverting thousands of dollars donated to a neighborhood church into the organization's accounts. Gigante was not simply overseeing these operations from a distance. The federal ruling in United States versus Gigante documented 5 separate short visits he made to a psychiatric facility between 1977 and 1983, during the precise years when the Concrete Club was at its most active. He was checking in for tune-ups, reinforcing his psychiatric record, while simultaneously directing one of the most profitable construction extortion schemes in New York history. In May of 1980, he convened a meeting at a restaurant on Thompson Street to question a Genovese member who had allegedly committed an unauthorized killing. Within a month and a half, the member was dead. In the early 1980s, he met directly with Gambino underboss Sammy Gravano to resolve an interfamily dispute. He was the boss of the organization in every functional sense. He was also, to all medical and legal appearances, a man who did not know what year it was. In June of 1983, FBI agents planted a listening device inside the Palma Boys Social Club. They had been building toward this for 2 years. Rudolph Giuliani had arrived as United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York in 1983 with a specific theory of prosecution. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, had been on the books since 1970, but prosecutors had been slow to use it to its full potential. Giuliani saw the opening. RICO allowed a criminal enterprise to be prosecuted as a whole, not merely case by case. If you could prove that an organization existed, that it had a leadership structure, and that it had engaged in a pattern of criminal activity, you could indict the entire leadership of that organization in a single case. What Giuliani wanted to indict was the commission itself, the governing body of the five families, which had been operating in one form or another since 1931. The investigation ran for 5 years. It deployed 171 court-approved wiretaps, 350 FBI agents, and 100 New York police detectives. It placed bugs in the Palma Boys Social Club in East Harlem, in the home of Gambino boss Paul Castellano on Staten Island, in the Jaguar sedan driven by Lucchese underboss Salvatore Avellino, and in the office of Colombo family soldier Ralph Scopo, where the concrete club's business was regularly discussed with construction executives. The Palma Boys bug recorded for more than a year. It captured Salerno in conversation with dozens of senior mob figures, discussing construction contracts, union business, interfamily disputes, and the internal affairs of the organization. The conversations were thorough, incriminating, and detailed. They established Salerno as a man deeply embedded in the operations of the Genovese family. They also captured, during a conversation between Salerno and his capo Matthew Ianiello, a single line that would later acquire a meaning the FBI did not initially recognize. Salerno and Ianiello were reviewing a list of prospective candidates to be inducted as maid members in another family. Salerno was frustrated that the nicknames of the candidates had not been included on the list. He looked at the document and said, "Captured on tape and entered into the record. I'll leave this up to the boss." The FBI heard that line as the irritation of a busy man delegating a minor task. They catalogued it. They moved on. It would be years before anyone understood what it actually meant. The indictment came on February 25th, 1985. Salerno and the bosses of the other four families were charged with extortion, labor racketeering, and murder for operating the commission as a criminal enterprise. 207 witnesses would ultimately be called. Giuliani announced publicly that the verdict, when it came, would result in dismantling the ruling council of La Cosa Nostra. On that same day, February 25th, 1985, a Palma Boys bug captured Salerno discussing Gigante's hospitalization with Vincent Caffaro. Salerno speculated maybe it's a fake. Caffaro replied carefully, "If it was what you say it was, a phony, his doctor would have been there." His doctor wasn't there. The hospital took care of it. Salerno had been arrested that morning. Gigante had checked himself into St. Vincent's Hospital, claiming chest pains. 7 days later, Gigante left the hospital. The following week, he returned. The bug caught everything. What it could not catch was the thing it was not listening for, the sound of a man deferring to someone who was not in the room. The trial began on September 9th, 1986, in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, before Judge Richard Owen. The defendants sat in rows. Salerno was at the front. Fortune magazine had named him the most powerful and wealthiest gangster in America, and the government had organized its case accordingly, placing him at the top of an indictment that named him as the boss of the Genovese family and the dominant figure on the ruling commission. He sat stone-faced. He said almost nothing. He had spent 50 years in organized crime by practicing the discipline of silence in legal settings, and he practiced it here. The other defendants brought their own styles to the courtroom. Carmine Persico, the boss of the Colombo family, made the unusual decision to act as his own attorney, conducting cross-examinations and delivering arguments before the jury. The spectacle of a mafia boss arguing his own innocence before a federal jury was, by any measure, extraordinary. Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese family sat in the same posture as Salerno, quiet, contained, waiting. The government's case rested on the recorded conversations, the physical surveillance, and the testimony of Angelo Leonardo, a former acting boss of the Cleveland crime family, who had become, at that point, the highest ranking organized crime figure ever to cooperate with the government. Leonardo's testimony connected the Commission's operations to specific decisions and specific crimes in a way that the recordings alone could not fully accomplish. The trial lasted 10 weeks. During that period, the FBI received intelligence that the 5 family bosses had discussed having Giuliani killed. John Gotti, who had recently assumed control of the Gambino family by ordering the unsanctioned murder of Paul Castellano, was reportedly in favor of the assassination, along with Persico. The Genovese, Bonanno, and Lucchese bosses were against it. The plan was not carried out. On January 13th, 1987, Judge Owen sentenced 7 of the defendants to 100 years in federal prison each. Anthony Salerno received 100 years. He was 75 years old. Vincent Gigante had not been charged with a single count. Shortly after the verdict, Anthony Salerno's longtime right-hand man made a decision. His name was Vincent Cafaro. He was known as the Fish. In 1974, he was made a full member of the family and assigned to Salerno's crew at the Palma Boys Social Club. For 12 years, he had been Salerno's driver, his appointment secretary, and his closest daily associate. He had watched the operation from the inside, from the beginning. He had, in his own words as later testified, come to regard Salerno as a father figure. In March of 1986, Cafaro had been indicted on separate racketeering charges involving concrete supply companies. His son Thomas was indicted in the same case. The government offered Thomas a plea agreement. Thomas declined it. He pleaded guilty and went to prison, choosing imprisonment over cooperation, demonstrating to the Genovese family that the Cafaro name still stood for loyalty. His father watched this and understood what it cost. In September of 1986, while sitting in jail awaiting trial on his own charges, Vincent Cafaro contacted the government about becoming an informant. From October of 1986 through March 19, 1987, Cafaro attended family meetings wearing a recording device. The tapes he produced were supplementary evidence in an already concluded trial. Their real value was in what Cafaro told the FBI directly. Anthony Salerno had never been the real boss of the Genovese family. He had been a front, a title holder, a man whose visibility and reputation and genuine criminal power made him a convincing surface to present to law enforcement, while the actual authority resided somewhere else entirely. The front boss system had been in place, Cafaro confirmed, since 1969. The real boss was Vincent Gigante. On March 20th, 1987, the government revealed in open court that Cafaro was cooperating. Anthony Salerno was already in federal prison. The 100-year sentence was in place and would not be revisited. The man who had actually given the orders was still free. He was also, at the moment of Cafaro's cooperation, in his bathrobe. 3 years after Anthony Salerno began serving his sentence, the government finally moved against the man who had given him his orders. In 1990, Gigante was indicted on federal racketeering charges. The charges were substantial: conspiracy to commit murder, labor racketeering, bid rigging. One of the most significant elements of the indictment concerned the Windows case, a scheme in which 4 of the 5 families had manipulated bids for 75% of the $191 million in window replacement contracts that the New York City Housing Authority had granted between 1978 and 1990. The scheme had involved carpenters' unions, subcontractors, and a layered system of kickbacks that reached across the entire city's housing infrastructure. Gigante's response to the indictment was the one he had always used. He was hospitalized. His lawyers presented psychiatric reports. He was described as schizophrenic, demented, suffering from organic brain damage, incapable of understanding the charges against him or assisting in his own defense. He had been treated, his attorneys argued, for psychiatric disorders on 28 separate occasions. Between 1969 and 1995, he had been confined in multiple facilities. He had a primary treating psychiatrist of long standing. The record of his illness was, in its documentation, overwhelming. In 1993, additional charges arrived: conspiracy to murder multiple organized crime figures, including Gambino boss John Gotti. The background to the murder conspiracy charges against Gotti required a brief accounting. When Gotti had ordered the murder of Paul Castellano in December of 1985, he had done so without obtaining the commission's approval. Gigante, who regarded the unsanctioned killing of a sitting boss as a fundamental violation of the organization's rules, had ordered retaliation. On April 13th, 1986, a bomb destroyed the car of Gambino underboss Frank DeCicco. Gotti had planned to be in the car that day but changed his plans. DeCicco was killed instead. The government now charged that Gigante had continued to pursue Gotti's elimination. The murder conspiracy never succeeded. Gotti's high public profile, the constant presence of media and law enforcement around him, made it effectively impossible to reach him without creating a spectacle that would bring the full weight of federal attention down on the Genovese organization. The Chin, who valued silence and invisibility above all things, was not willing to pay that price for a principle. For 7 years after his 1990 indictment, Gigante delayed trial. Competency hearings, doctors, judges, all confirming the same thing: he wasn't fit to stand trial. The system he built was working. Then the insiders spoke. Gravano, Darko, Leonetti all said the same thing. Gigante wasn't broken. He was in control. Crazy like a fox. In August 1996, the court ruled him competent. The trial began in June 1997. He arrived in a wheelchair, silent, twitching, distant, still performing. The jury deliberated for 16 hours. On July 25th, 1997, guilty, he didn't react. On December 18th, 1997, he was sentenced to 12 years, 69 years old. Before sentencing, the judge told him to change out of his sweatpants. He stood up, changed, came back. The act never stopped. He said good morning to the judge. He listened to the sentence, and the performance continued. Even after conviction, Gigante kept the act alive, appearing confused, detached, as if nothing had changed. But behind it, the organization was still running. Orders moved through his son, through intermediaries. The Genovese family held. The government kept watching. By 2003, prosecutors had enough. New charges, new tapes, clear evidence that he was fully coherent and still in control. So he made a decision. On April 7th, 2003, Vincent Gigante walked into a Brooklyn courtroom and ended it. No wheelchair, no act, just clarity. He pleaded guilty. And when asked if the insanity had been fake for decades, he said yes. More than 30 years of deception collapsed in a moment. The man who had fooled everyone finally stopped pretending. That morning, he admitted it was all a lie. He took a few more years on his sentence. His family was protected. The system he built held. And just like that, one of the longest cons in mafia history ended with a single word. Anthony Salerno never heard the truth. He died on July 27th, 1992, in a federal prison hospital. 80 years old, 5 years into a sentence he would never finish. His health had failed. His time had run out. And in the official record, he was still the boss. But he wasn't. He had gone to prison for an organization run by someone else. The crimes were real. The conviction was real. But the role he carried was not. His lawyer couldn't save him. Nothing could. The evidence was too strong. He was buried in the Bronx, his story ending exactly as it had been written for him. The man who designed that system, Philip Lombardo, had already died years earlier. Quietly, far from it all, his structure outlived him. Vincent Cafaro, who confirmed the truth, died in 2004. and Vincent Gigante, the man behind everything, died on December 19th, 2005, in the same federal prison. 13 years later, same place. One man carried the title, the other held the power. Both ended the same way. Thank you for watching. Like the video, subscribe, and click the next file. This story goes deeper.